Thank you all so much for being a part of our webinar this evening. And we have Dr. Ryan Walsh, who will be presenting this evening. And Dr. Walsh maintains a full-time private practice in Keller, Texas. He's a diplomat of the American Board of Endodontics and serves on the scientific advisory board of the Journal of Endo. Dr. Walsh also maintains an appointment as adjunct assistant professor at Texas A&M College of Dentistry and is actively involved in clinical research pertaining to bioactive materials, resorption processes, and clinical outcomes. He has lectured nationally and internationally on several topics in his specialty and has published multiple peer-reviewed articles and abstracts. He is our bioceramic guy. So without further ado, we'll let Dr. Walsh take it away, and we hope you all enjoy. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Awesome, Allison. Well, thank you for the intro and certainly to Mike, Jason, BJ, Allison, and the Avalon team. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for tuning in on a Tuesday night to get a little CE and talk some bioceramics and endo. So we're going to talk about, I guess, in my opinion, how bioceramics have really revolutionized our specialty and our role as clinicians in the endodontic world. And why are we here and why are we talking about these? Well, going back to 2017, I can't believe that's 8 years ago now. But in 2017, the global bioceramics market was 12.5 billion with a B dollars, and it's obviously projected to go up. I would estimate today that's substantially higher now. Because, really what are bioceramics? They're all around us. They're things that we know really well, but maybe really haven't taken a step back to think about really what are bioceramics, right? I mean, we're all familiar with ceramic crowns. Anything that's a ceramic inserted into the body is technically a bioceramic. So ortho brackets, we have this artificial hip joint, the ball and socket. I mean, that's a medical bioceramic. And then in the bottom right, we have these zirconia implants. So bioceramics, especially in dentistry, are all around us. No matter where we go, you'd be hard pressed to try to avoid them. But if you're talking to an endodontist and we're talking bioceramics, really what we're talking about are dental materials, right? Things we're going to use inside of the tooth. And so to kind of help subdivide that, let's talk about bioactive bioceramics. And so bioactive ceramics, bioactive materials in general, I kind of divide into two broad categories. More or less things we're going to use inside the tooth or things we're going to use outside the tooth. Now, as with anything, it's never a hard and fast rule. There's always some overlap in between, and some of the MTA-like materials can be used outside of a tooth and vice versa. But nonetheless, that's kind of a broad categorization. So let's evaluate these bioactive bioceramics, these MTA-like materials a little bit further and kind of discuss where we're going to use them, because they're not just used as sealers. They're not just used as pulpotomies. We're able to use these for a whole host of different purposes these days. I mean, sure, we can do pulp caps, perforation repairs. Certainly, we've been using MTA-like materials for perforation repairs for a long time. Back when Dr. Mahmoud Torbenjad was introducing MTA, that's one of the things that he was promoting their use for. But also pulpotomies, right? Vital pulp therapy. As an endodontist, I get teased once in a while about being a pulp killer, and it really couldn't be further from the truth. As endodontists, we're pulp lovers. We're pulp biologists. So if we can help promote healthy tissue formation and maintain vital pulps, especially in young people, why not? What a huge advantage to have at our fingertips to promote pulp maturation and help allow these young people to maintain their tooth. Certainly obturation and use as sealers, that's a very well-known and very common use. And then things like apexification and root-in surgeries, things that we as specialists are probably doing on a more routine basis than some of our GP colleagues. So let's dive into this a little bit further. And those are some of the main uses of them. But really, how do they work? Why is it even functional, right? Well, if we think about it, our body's made up of roughly 70% water, give or take. But our body's not just a huge sink of water, right? We have these molecules and these ions in our interstitial fluid and our extracellular fluid throughout our body. And thankfully we do, because that's really important to how these bioactive materials really work. So they're interacting with not only the water, they're water loving, they're hydrophilic. So they're absorbing the water from our body, but they're also interacting on a microscopic level with some of these other ions. And so I want you to take a look at the ones I've highlighted here, calcium and phosphate. If you think about it, dig way back into your brain from like dental anatomy or some of the early years in dental school and think, what are these precursors for? Right? They're in our body all over the place, but they're really precursors for hydroxyapatite, right? So these materials, these bioceramic materials interact with what we have naturally present in our body and stimulate hard tissue formation. We know that they can stimulate bone formation, dentin formation. We'll show you some histology here at the very end that shows not they're able to induce cementum formation. So we're able to stimulate hard tissue formation in the correct place, in the correct location, at the correct time. And so for me, I think that's just fascinating that we can do this predictably now. And now we have all these materials right at our fingertips, not only here in the US, but worldwide. I was in Nepal a couple of years ago, and they're starting to use bioceramic sealers there. So these materials are all around us and becoming ever more prevalent as we move forward in our specialty. But you have to walk before you can run, right? So let's talk a little bit about where we've been so we can understand where we're going and what's on the horizon moving forward. So ProRoot MTA was kind of the OG, if you will, kind of the original bioceramic material or tricalcium silicate to come to the market. And we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Carolyn Primus, who is one of the inventors of this material. And it's been famous for a long time because it was the only thing like it when it first came out. And I think it's really interesting because it's this innocuous powder, right? Both white and gray, but it's this innocuous powder that we started using in and around our teeth differently than we had been using any other materials in the past. But one of the other interesting things about it is that it's really just medical grade Portland cement. And so I think it's interesting that Dr. Torbenijad thought to place medical grade or place Portland cement into a tooth and expect a reaction. But somewhere along the line, I heard that his dad was a Mason, and that's maybe what stimulated his intellectual curiosity. And so he ended up trying that, and it ended up working famously, right? So we have this basic cement powder that we mix with a liquid, and we add in radiopacifier, and that really is the beauty of mineral trioxide aggregate. That is MTA. Now, in the original formulations, they used bismuth oxide. And bismuth oxide uh, is not advantageous for us as dental clinicians because it stains teeth. We've all heard of or seen some of these teeth that stain colors over time. And again, talking about using these in young individuals, if we're staining an anterior tooth, yes, we're maintaining the pulp, but we're providing an aesthetically poor result. So nowadays we have some materials that use other types of radiopacifiers, which we'll talk about throughout the night. So in addition to discoloration, that was a big challenge with MTA, mixing was also a big challenge with MTA because you had this powder that you mixed with a liquid, and we're all used to mixing materials like IRM, but MTA is very finicky. And not only that, but it was really expensive for the time. And so we're mixing this powder with a liquid, trying to get to a wet sand-like consistency so that we can pack it into some delivery vehicle. The map systems around. I mean, we have a map system here at the office. It hasn't been getting much use, not because I think it's a bad product, but because it's challenging, right? You're mixing MTA, you're putting it in these little tips and trying to deliver it 20 some millimeters down into a tooth. And so I found that to be really challenging. Combine that with the cleanup so that it doesn't form a concrete block in the tip was just frustrating. And so when it came to using these materials, I liked the MTA block just about as good as anything else. But still, these materials are finicky and hard to use. And again, talking about before, staining the teeth. So combining those things, there were some certain obstacles that we had to overcome if we're going to move these materials forward, because early on, we started seeing some of the favorable properties of these both in vivo and in vitro. And so some of the early studies on MTA came out, and as soon as the patent for MTA expired, the market was flooded with a bunch of different types of materials. And I was fortunate enough to get to work with Dr. Primus and Neo MTA early on back in my residency. And this is a self-mixed material, right? It comes in a powder and a liquid. Uniquely here, it came with an anti-washout gel. So one of our early studies out of our office, you see Saeed and Casey, those are my two practice partners. And so we started using this as a sealer and as a packable type of material. And over time, we wanted to track our results and see how things were progressing. And overall, in our study, we found about a 91% success, which is pretty spot on with contemporary endodontics and bioceramic materials. But again, this was a self-mixed material. Although it's challenging sometimes to mix, one of the unique things about self-mixed materials is that you can determine how you're going to mix it. In other words, the cases that we evaluated were not just sealer cases. Yes, some of them were sealer with gutta percha, and other times, as I'm showing here, we literally mixed the powder with lidocaine and packed it into canal spaces. And so that's one of the unique things about these materials is that you can use them in a plethora of different ways. But again, it goes back to having to put it out on a glass slab and mix. Then, over time, we started what I call the premixed revolution. And in my opinion, that really started in 2008 and 2009 when Brasseler introduced EndoSequence BC Sealer. Having a pre-mixed sealer that had the same, had similar biological properties to ProRoot, but we didn't have to mix it, and it was color stable. We were able to inject it into teeth. I mean, that really changed the dogma of how we're using and the ways that we're using MTA-like products. And so after Brasseler came out, then again, just like anything else, everybody's kind of bigger, better, faster, stronger, kind of putting their own little twist and tweak on things to how we can make it better, how we can improve handling, how we can improve biological properties. So let's dive in and let's talk a little bit more, about sealers because it's one of those things that there's so many on the market. How do you choose the right one, right? How do you know what's good? How do you know what's bad? How do you know what's going to work best in your hands? Um, and and again, let's try to classify and break things down a little bit so that we can better understand what's involved and um, how they're benefiting us in private practice. So, and again, in my opinion, these are kind of the major players in the game, and you see them broken down into two subcategories, if you will, kind of the top group and the bottom group. And the reason being is that these are dramatically different materials, although the manufacturers, reps, websites, they're all going to tell you that, yeah, they're bioceramic materials. But the way that the top and bottom differ is that the bottom group contains resin. Not only does it contain resin, but by and large, they contain a lot less bioactive cement. So for bang for your buck, you're not getting as good a value just from a biological standpoint, but even further from a biological standpoint, they have resin. So those molecules of di and tricalcium silicate and calcium aluminate that are trying to escape and interact with the body, absorb that water, promote hydroxyapatite formation, are locked up in this resin matrix. So you can't get to it. It's like having $100, but yeah, it's into this ice block. Sure, I have it in theory, but I can't necessarily take that and spend it. Conversely, the materials at the top of that chart have the bioactive cement readily available to interact with our body tissues. So we're going to get more biological activity, and really the ones on the top aren't any more expensive. You just have a lot higher concentration or a lot higher proportion of the bioactive cement. So for bang for your buck, these materials are going to be superior biologically. So let's take a couple of these and evaluate them a little bit further. A couple key players, I would call it, in the marketplace. And I'd be a bad dad if I didn't at least shamelessly put my girls into the presentation at least once. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because, my girls, they all look similar, blue-eyed, light hair, more or less. Um, they're all kind of goofy and have their own little personalities. And that's really how these bioceramic sealers behave and how they're made up as well. They all have slight nuances and different things in them that are beneficial and some things that I like more about others and less about others. So let's kind of walk through a little bit here. I'm using Brasseler's BC Sealer as kind of a reference because it's kind of like a household name, and a lot of people are familiar with it. So, talking about the bioactive cement here, uh, it contains primarily di and tricalcium silicates. Neo MTA from our friends at Avalon is a combination of silicates and aluminates, and then you kind of pivot to the other end of the spectrum, talking about Regen, which has bioglass and illuminates. So there's kind of continuum of different types of bioactive materials. So to compare and contrast, I really like having the illuminates present in my bioceramic sealer because illuminates offer a few distinct advantages that silicates don't have. There's three primary advantages in my mind and one is that it increases the acid resistance. And if you think about the environments that we're working in, I mean, we're working an inch down or 20 some millimeters at least most of the time into a canal that's usually immediately adjacent to a periapical infection or some type of periapical inflammatory response. Periapical infections are notoriously acidic, right? So they have a very acidic environment and have a very low pH. So if we're working in that type of environment, being able to incorporate illuminates that will help prevent acid degradation and help maintain stability in an acidic environment, to me is a huge benefit and very advantageous to what we're doing on a microscopic level. In addition to being acid resistant, they increase the mechanical strength and they'll decrease the set time. So again, things that are working to our advantage, acid resistance, decreased set time, and increased mechanical strength all play to our advantage. And more or less, these cements contain about 50% bioactive material. The other thing I want to talk about is the radiopacifier. Again, we had talked previously about MTA containing bismuth oxide, which grays teeth. It, again, notoriously turns teeth colored. Sometimes you can bleach it out, other times you can't. But if you can use a material that just plain doesn't have bismuth oxide, all the better, right? We can avoid that step altogether, and you can tell your patient that, hey, no matter where I put this, it's not going to turn your tooth colors. This is a stable, color fast material. So Neo MTA uses tantalite, tantalum oxide, Endosequence uses zirconia, and then Regen's zinc oxide. So here it's kind of six of one, half dozen another. The main point here is that we want to choose one primarily that's non-discoloring. So make sure if you're going to pick a bioceramic sealer to use or a bioceramic putty that you're picking one that does not have bismuth oxide. That's kind of the key ingredient there. So moreover, our materials these days are pretty fantastic. They're color stable. They're not going to discolor teeth. Again, as they're absorbing that water, one of the huge benefits of bioceramic materials is that in that hydration reaction where that cement is soaking up the water, they release calcium hydroxide. We've been using calcium hydroxide in teeth for decades, and we're using it as an intra-appointment medicament to help decrease the bacterial load, right? So calcium hydroxide is an antibacterial. So just as a byproduct of the setting reaction of these materials, we're releasing calcium hydroxide. I read a study that showed depending on the material you're using, you can get up to a 1 to 3 month kind of timed release dose of calcium hydroxide as these materials set. So what a huge advantage, again, talking about the microenvironment that we're in, helping to eradicate that bacteria as well as promote hydroxyapatite and hard tissue formation. Again, hydrophilic and dimensional stability. That's one thing that in dentistry that we really don't have with a lot of our materials. I mean, think about composites. We're still incrementally curing them in some cases to prevent shrinkage, or we're considering C factor, how many walls we're touching and what bulk of material we're using, because we know they shrink away from the tooth wall. Well, hydraulic silicate type cements and bioceramic materials are the opposite. As a matter of fact, some studies show that there's 0.02% expansion. So let's call it dimensionally stable, if not slightly expansile. So again, what a great property to have at our fingertips when we're trying to seal canals an inch down inside of a tooth. So these materials, I've talked about some favorable properties, such as calcium hydroxide release, being hydrophilic. They've really changed the way that we're obturating canals these days. I mean, we're no longer just plugging a hole. In years past, at least the way I was taught, and Michael Buck, if you're on here, the way that you were taught was lateral compaction. So you put one gutta percha cone in with a little bit of sealer, and then you try to pack as many other cones around that as you can, right? So that's a gutta percha eccentric obturation. We're trying to fit as much gutta percha into the canal space as we can. But now with bioceramic sealers, it's quite the opposite. We're going for a sealer-centric obturation because the sealer's where all the magic happens. That's where all the bioactivity is. Gutta percha is a bioinert plug, more or less. But it's really important in our obturations because it helps with the hydraulic flow. So let me show you a little video here that I put together. On On the left, we're going to use NeoSealer Flow, and this is the Flex Flow tip. This is what I use in private practice. And you see it's got the stopper on it, and I'm injecting the sealer. Um, I set my stopper 2 to 3 millimeters short of the working length or where it binds. So I don't want my tip to bind in the canal, just a little bit short, and then inject and let it fill the canal space. And then watch what happens when we use our gutta percha cone and take that to length. It's not only allowing the sealer to flow all the way to the length, but it's helping with hydraulic pressure, helping that sealer flow into the little lateral canals that are there, and even creating a little sealer puff at the root tip. So these sealers flow really, really well, and they work really well when we have some hydraulic pressure from the gutta percha to come in behind it. Now here you can see the BC sealer. The tip's a little bit bigger, so I can't get it quite as far into the canal space, but nonetheless, we'll fill it up to the canal orifice, and then we'll use our gutta percha and watch again how well it flows into the lateral canals. So we really transitioned these days from a gutta percha centric obturation to a sealer centric. One thing I also want you to keep a look at is that when I zoom in, you're not seeing a whole bunch of orange show through, or in other words, you're not seeing a lot of the gutta percha touch the canal walls. That's because it's bathed in a sea of the bioceramic sealer. So that way, when I'm obturating my canals, I know that the sealer is what's in contact with the dentin walls. I know the sealer is what's filling all the little isthmus and little ramifications, little lateral canals. So it's going to stimulate that hydroxyapatite and stimulate the dentin formation. So we've changed over the years from a gutta percha centric to a sealer centric obturation. And I think this is a beautiful illustration from Dr. Mitu Kohli off the AAE's website showing what sealer-centric obturation looks like these days. This is what I hope that my cases are looking like when we're finished. And what you can see is that you're seeing gutta percha cones, 2 or 3 cones, depending on the tooth, floating in a sea of bioceramic sealer. That's what we want because, again, that bioceramic sealer is what's in contact with the dentin, thus in contact with the surrounding periapical tissues. So let's take that a step further. I had a tooth that came back to me a couple of years ago because of a vertical root fracture. And these, you'll see these large fractures. Those are drying or desiccation artifacts, not the actual root fracture, which is on the other side of the tooth. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at a cross section of tooth number 20. In the bottom right, what looks like the sun, that's the gutta percha. And then the little radiating beams, if you will, off of the central core there, those are the dentin tubules. And what you'll notice is that, especially next to the central core of gutta percha and sealer, you see a lot of bright white. Well, the bright white little lines they're the striations that are moving away from the central core, those are what we're presuming to be hydroxyapatite formation. In other words, some type of hard tissue deposit that's mineralizing inside those canals. So this is the SEM we took at 120, but let's zoom in at 650. What are we learning? What are we seeing? Again, the bottom right here, that's gutta percha. And then the dentin is to the top left. And this bright white layer you see in between, that's the neosealer flow. Now there's a little bit of desiccation artifact. So you see a little bit of void space. And we also had to cut this with a burr to get it to show the cross section. But again, if you're looking from the neosealer flow interface between gutta percha and dentin, you're seeing it penetrate several hundred microns out into the dentin tubules, stimulating that hydroxyapatite and hard tissue response, which is exactly what we're looking for when we're trying to seal canals. All right, we're not just plugging the hole, we're interacting with the body, stimulating this tissue formation and promoting healing overall. Now, I had mentioned earlier the different types of tips that I'm using to inject. Everybody has their own preference. I mean, even within my practice, there's a preference of using the 29 gauge Navi tip or the Flex Flow tip. But when you're choosing a tip, what I want to show you is that although they look the same, right? They're both lure lock tips. They are absolutely not the same. And the reason this is important is if you look inside the hub, what you see is the Flex Flow tip on the right, or the MST, the saving tip, has 80% waste reduction. As opposed to the tip on the left, you're filling that whole hub with sealer. You could probably obturate 2 teeth with the amount of sealer that's wasted in that tip. Conversely, on the right side, the flex flow tip, it has this small little port that screws into the lure lock. So the only sealer that's being expressed is that's right through the channel. So maybe you could obturate a couple extra canals. And why is this important? Well, it's important because bioceramic sealers, um, they're not cheap, right? It's an investment that you're making to help promote healing and provide better care for your patients. So, for instance, Brasslers, I think it's $150 a tube, more or less. Avalon's on the right is $79 a tube. That's all day, everyday pricing. And so if I can make that $79 stretch further, I'm a practice owner just like many of you are. So that's better for my bottom line. So not only am I providing a biologically superior material, but now I can reduce the amount of waste and put more money in my pocket at the end of the day. So again, we've talked about how we're using these materials. We've talked about sealer cone or a single cone obturation, but none of this is anything of importance if we don't have literature to back it up. Again, that's one thing as endodontists that we're really good about is being evidence-based learners and using the literature and making sure that we're tried and true of why we're doing what we're doing. And so again, kind of making the comparison between BC Sealer and Neo Sealer Flow. This is a study out of Texas A&M where I did my residency. This is a beautiful paper by Elizabeth Chabowski. She was just a couple years behind me in residency, and they went into private practice and they evaluated the healing success over time, retrospectively, of cases treated with endosequence BC. And overall, they found about 91% success, 90.9. And again, that's consistent with current endodontic practices. That's an accepted success rate. And again, great cases. So transitioning this and taking this a step further, we wanted to do the same thing out of my office because prior to NeoSealer Flow being launched in 2019, we used endosequence BC Sealer. So for several years, we were using this on every case. So we had a nice data set of cases from the same three operators, Casey, Saeed, and myself, of endosequence BC and Avalon's NeoSealer Flow. And so we had 657 cases, about twice as many as Elizabeth's paper, but a little bit shorter follow-up. And so we were comparing these, not only the overall success rate, but how were the success rates between the two materials, right? So again, we have the same three operators. And what we found is that overall had a year and change. We had a year and a half, I think. We had about a 95% success. So again, that shorter recall, I think, will normalize down to about a 90% success, 91% give or take. But the interesting thing here was that NeoSealer Flow had the same success as BC Sealer. And so to me, that's important because I had done a lot of the foundational research on Neo MTA and the NeoSealer the products. And so for me to be able to translate that clinically and say, okay, yes, I do have a very comparable material that I like to work with that I think has some favorable biological properties, as well as some favorable economical impact on my practice was really important. So this is a paper that we just published last year, thanks to Dr. Christian Lapierre, who's was a resident, but now he's in private practice out in Las Vegas. So thank you to him for all of his help. And so far, at least to my knowledge, this is the only paper showing clinical results using NeoSealer Flow. So that's all fine and dandy. And that was, again, using single cone obturation by and large throughout most of those two previous studies. But as clinicians, we know that not all canals come in the same flavor. They're not all the same shape. If every case I had a nice, perfectly round, straight canal, life would be pretty darn easy. As a matter of fact, I'd probably be out of a job. But the fact of the matter is, single cone's great when it's appropriate, right? We can't single cone every single canal. At least in my hands, I don't feel that I can single cone every canal. And part of that's because if we're using this hydraulic pressure to push the sealer into the canals, if we have a really huge canal space, we can have a 0.6 tapered cone or a large cone, and that may still not have enough hydraulic pressure to help flow that sealer into all the little ramifications. And so in cases like that, we have to be a little bit versatile, and we have to have some other things at our fingertips. And so for me, in cases where I can't appropriately single cone a tooth, I'm doing some type of modified worm technique. So let me show you why I'm using sometimes a modified worm technique. Because buccal canals of maxillary molars and mesial canals of lower molars are by and large pretty round. They're very amenable to single cone technique. But if you get into some of these oval or long oval canals, like distals of lower molars, sometimes palatals of upper molars, but those really ovoid maxillary premolars, those are hard to single cone because if even if you're using an '06 cone like this, apically it may fit well, but look at all the space laterally. And so sometimes that's where I feel that I can't get enough hydraulic pressure to flow my sealer into all the little ramifications inside the canal system. So in cases like this, I like to use a heated technique where I'll sear down to where the cone fits well, apply a little pressure, and then backfill. Kind of a continuous wave type of obturation. And again, that's all fine and dandy. But if we're going to use a warm technique, we need to use a sealer that's compatible with warm techniques. Not all sealers are, right? Many sealers are amenable to single cone. But as soon as you apply heat, that takes a whole different variable. That takes things to a different level because as you apply the heat, these sealers have an organic carrier inside of them. That's what makes them flow. That's what makes them a liquid. So if you take that organic carrier and you heat it, if it's not appropriately suited for warm operation, it's just going to evaporate off and it's going to leave you with a chalky mess. Not only that, but I can't help but think if that desiccates and leaves a chalky mess inside your canal or inside your chamber, I mean, how is that impacting the biological property of that cement, right? We don't know. However, we do know that if the sealer maintains a sealer-like viscosity throughout, then it's maintaining its biological properties throughout the obturation process. So here's kind of a down and dirty experiment I like to show because it's very impactful. And so on the upper left is neosealer flow. On the bottom right is AH plus bioceramic. That's since been removed from the market. That's one of those very low bioactive cement containing materials. But in the upper right and lower left, those are endosequence products. Upper right is BC Sealer. Bottom left is BC High Flow, which was originally designed to be used in heated techniques. So what I want you to look for is I want you to look for changes in the sealer as we move through. And we've used 190C, roughly 200C, because that's what a lot of heat pluggers are set at. So that's where we're getting this measure. So this is live time video. There's no cuts, there's no edits. This is straight live time. So the first sealer I want you to look at is in the bottom right, that Dentsply H plus. And you can immediately see it starts to get hard, kind of crinkly, and starts falling over. Yeah, that organic carrier is not designed at all for heat. Now look at the Brasseler products, especially the lower left, the Endosequence High Flow, which is supposed to be designed for heated techniques, already has these little porosities and these little bubbles in it. And the upper right is starting to turn brown, right? Again, the organic carrier inside that is evaporating out, and in my mind, changing some of the biological or for sure material properties as it progresses. And BC Sealer crumbles apart. The only sealer of this group that maintained a sealer-like consistency over time at 200C was NeoSealer Flow. So to me, if I don't have to change sealers just because of the technique, I can pick one sealer, use it for all of my obturation techniques. I mean, that's fantastic. That makes my clinical life easy. That's money in the bank. I don't have to store a whole bunch of different materials and then swap them out at the time I'm doing the procedure. I already have the material I need right at hand. So here's another subset of materials. The first one I want you to watch is the upper right, the diadent. Watch what happens as soon as this touches heat. This is a very classic example of having an organic carrier that just boils off. I mean, it's bubbling as it's touching, right? And then again, if you look at the bottom right, this is Edge's one of Edge's bioceramic sealers. Now they have a host of them, but this looks very similar to that Brasseler product, where you're starting to see it turn a little bit beige. You're starting to see these little porosities. All the while, NeoSealer Flow is maintaining the same appearance. You're not seeing any evaporation bubbles from the organic liquid. You're not seeing any color change, and yet it still maintains its sealer-like consistency. So again, taking a product that you can use for multiple different techniques. Now we have some literature support to show that it's clinically effective and comparable to some other things on the market. To me, that's an easy choice in my sealer. But nowadays, minimally invasive endodontics is all the rage. We have lasers, we have gentle waves that can clean these canals incredibly effectively. And this is a case that I treated late last year. We had a gentle wave in our office for a few months. And so this is, may not be as minimally invasive as some of y'all out there who are listening, but for me this is pretty minimally invasive, especially those buccal canals where I'm using a Slim Shaper ZS1. So I'm down at a size 1503, give or take, but I'm using that gentle wave and using the enhanced irrigation properties to help clean the canal space. But in doing so, it presents a couple challenges, right? Because now not only is the canal smaller, so it's harder to get a sealer flow cannula down there or a sealer syringe down far, but also the sealer needs to flow differently, right? Because these canals are so much smaller, the fluid dynamics are much different. So we need a sealer that's going to flow better in these really small, minimally invasive types of canal preparations. And that's where Avalon's come out with NeoSealer Easy Flow. I guess in my mind, especially for you minimally invasive folks out there. But you can see that this flows well all the way past the root tip, right? So I'm seeing some sealer puffs. I'm seeing some little lateral canals being expressed. And that's because NeoSealer Easy Flow is just that. It flows really, really well. It's less viscous than NeoSealer Flow. However, one of the beautiful things here is that these materials contain the same biological properties. In other words, the same core ingredients, the same di and tricalcium silicates, di and tricalcium aluminates are in these products in the same proportion, roughly 50%. You get the same heat tolerance, you get the same bioactivity. The difference here is how they mix the materials. So the way that NeoSealer Easy Flow is spun when it's mixed provides a completely different consistency than NeoSealer Flow. So property-wise, chemical-wise, nearly the same product, but the flow is dramatically different. Not only that, but in the Easy Flow, it comes with and can easily be expressed through the 29 gauge Navi tip. Conversely, NeoSealer Flow, the bottom right, cannot. So for the minimally invasive folks out there, that 29 gauge Navi tip gets down into the canal really far. And then not only that, but then you have the improved hydraulic properties of the Easy Flow to get into all those little puffs and little ramifications, little lateral canals that are cleaned out now with enhanced irrigation techniques. So again, things we've talked about throughout the course today is, there are a whole host of bioceramic advantages. Again, bioactivity. I've talked about that a few different times, and I'm going to show you just a couple of histology slides. If any of you haven't checked out Dr. Domenico Riccucci's histology, boy, I think it's second to none in the endo world these days. But bioactive materials are just that. They're here to stimulate and induce mineralization, not just of dentin, not just of cementum, but help provide healing of PDL and stimulate bone and hydroxyapatite formation. Today's materials are non-staining. Again, almost all the materials that we've talked about, especially NeoSealer Flow and Easy Flow, are non-staining. They're going to stay white, just like the tube or the cylinder on the right. The one on the left contains bismuth oxide, so make sure that you're not using bismuth oxide, especially in an aesthetic area, because it's going to show through that final restoration. These materials are antibacterial because they have a high pH. As they set, they're releasing that calcium hydroxide, again, elevating that pH, creating an antimicrobial environment for, again, up to 1 to 3 months, depending on which material. So to me, that's a huge advantage that these materials have that most other dental materials do not. And then last but not least, dimensional stability, if not a slight expansion. So I promised histology for tooth nerds out there like me. This is actually our histology on the left from a canine model, and Dr. Domenico Riccucci's from a human model, extracted teeth, showing that we're not only getting healing at the root tip radiographically, but histologically we're gaining that as well. We're regenerating the alveolar bone, we're regenerating periodontal ligament, and both arrows in these cases, and the dog photo, and then in Dr. Riccucci's here, are showing cementum. So we're able to regenerate the correct tissue in the correct location at the correct time. And so for me, that's such an intriguing thing that we have these capabilities at our fingertips and that we can use them for everyday root canals. I mean, I've been using bioceramics exclusively in our practice for the last 7 or 8 years, 8 or 9 years now. And so we have these materials They're there, they're cost effective, and they're providing the best care that we have for our patients. And we're literally healing these teeth from the inside out. So, with that said, thank you guys all for attending. I wanted to keep it short and sweet tonight, highlight a few points. If you want to get in touch with me, here's my contact info. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions and turn it back over to Allison and the Avalon crew and go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. We appreciate you. You are always super knowledgeable on bioceramics, so thank you so, so much for joining us. And thank you, everybody, too, for being a part of the webinar this evening. We appreciate y'all. There is a section down below in the polls and quizzes. If y'all haven't already, if you could please answer those questions, that's super helpful for us. And then if y'all have any questions, if you would put them in the chat, we can have Dr. Walsh answer some questions for y'all. And then while we have a few seconds, I just wanted to introduce our team as well. Like I said at the beginning, I'm Allison. I'm our Western account manager. So I cover basically Texas, Louisiana, all the way up to the north and over to the west. And we have Jason Bedreau. He's located in Florida, but he handles all the East Coast. And then you have BJ Lunston, and he handles most of the central part of the US. He's based in Georgia, but that man is everywhere. So I'm sure many of you have seen him. And then we also have Mike Braun. He's our director of sales, our fearless leader in Minnesota. He's amazing and also very helpful as well. So if y'all have any questions, you can reach out to any of us. We're happy to help. And then, of course, too, at the end, you will be sent a questionnaire. And then once you fill that out, Zoe Cashin Tones will be the one that'll be sending you your CE credit. So if y'all have any questions, you'll be getting an email from us with all of our info on that. But I do see some questions over here, so I'm going to ask those really quickly. And then what is the set time for Avalon Sealer? And I think I can answer this question for y'all. I better be able to.
Fire away, Alice.
11 hours plus or minus an hour. So, but of course, it does set in vivo. And then if you're mixing your MTA sealer, if you're doing the powder gel mix, you do have a different set time as well. I think I might have said it wrong. 10 hours plus or minus an hour.
Okay. My answer was going to be 11 hours. That's what I've come to know.
Okay, perfect.
And then, yes, is it possible to share the papers you presented? Absolutely. Allison and Mike have those. If not, I can share them with you guys, and happy to share, give you the references, the abstracts, all that good stuff. I want you to have the literature at your fingertips.
Absolutely. And there also is a section on if you go to avalonbiomed.com, you'll be able to see a section on what that has all of our journal abstracts as well.
Cool. All right. I can see a couple questions here. So thanks, Marianne. Any product or technique recommendations for vital pulp therapy with bioceramics? Yeah, sure. I've been using the Neo suite of products for quite some time, and so Neo Putty is my go-to for vital pulp therapies or pulpotomies, things of that nature. Again, because it's a pre-mixed material. So in years past, we would mix the Neo MTA powder with an anti-washout gel, which you can still do. That's available. But the Neo Putty comes pre-mixed. It's so easy. It comes in a syringe, so it actually doesn't desiccate. You can actually express just what you need for that procedure, cap it, and that'll stay good for a really long time. I've never had a tube go bad on me. But then you can just roll it up in a little ball and place it directly over the exposed pulp. And from there, the recommendations say after you gently adapt it to the pulp, cover it with a glass ionomer, and then go ahead and do your buildup. Um, Plug your ears here, Avalon folks, but I like to just bond right over top of it because I've never had any problems with it washing out. So we know that we're not going to get as strong of a bond from the composite to the bioceramic as we are the composite to the dentin. Roughly 26 megapascals to dentin, roughly 4 to 9 for the bioceramic. And so for that, I'll just etch, prime, and bond right over. And as long as you don't blast your air water right onto the bioceramic, it's not going to wash out. And then just build up right over that. It just saves me adding a layer, saves a little bit of time. I think the less material interfaces we have there, the better. So that's my preference or my technique. Dr. Primus, thank you for asking the lid technique. Um, yes, I think there is a lot of promise with the lid technique. That's been coming to the forefront. I've been asked that question a whole heck of a lot here in the last year and a half or 2 years since I think AAE 23. It's just been hot to trot. We know that from some preliminary studies that we get a better seal, a better adaptation of the bioceramic material to the surrounding dentin if we do a lid type technique. So express a little sealer in your retro prep, then come back with the putty. And I like to roll my putty into kind of a long hot dog and then take little sections off the end and cut, they're kind of pointed then. And that fits very well right in the apical retro prep. So doing the lid technique is very easy and straightforward here with Neo Sealer Flow. Combine that with Neo Putty. The Flex Flow tip, you can actually even kind of make a little crinkle in it, and it fits right into your root end preps. So that makes life pretty easy when it comes to the lid technique. What's your opinion on the various in vitro studies that seem to show a oh, sorry, skipped on you. Wider variation in the solubility of BC sealers. Yeah, Charles, that's an awesome question, a really awesome question. And it's funny that we have Dr. Primus on here because she is actually one of the Dr. Primus, I'm going to butcher this, but one of the people who developed the standards and measures for the ISO standards. And so I think some of the challenge we have is that the ISO standards or the measures for bioceramic sealers and putties don't necessarily conform to the historic zinc oxide or epoxy resin. They're so vastly different. And also some of the solubility has to do with the interaction with the biological tissues, right? So we know that we're taking in some water and that we're going to release some calcium and potentially some silicate ions as well and interact with the calcium and phosphate. So I do think there's some credibility to say that we have to investigate this further. But I also think that the current measures don't take into account that interaction because historically, like an epoxy resin AH plus, that's not interacting at all with the body. We just need to make sure that it sets hard and the body's not sitting there eroding it. But for these bioactive materials, we want the interaction. That's what's stimulating the hydroxyapatite, which then is helping to form some of these stronger seals. So, Charles, to specifically answer your question, I think we need to further investigate this. But I think at this point, the body of overall evidence of using bioceramic sealers since 2000, I mean, if you want to talk pre-mixed only, 2008, 2009 to now, worldwide, I think we have such a volume of root canals that have been done, millions and millions of root canals, that if we were seeing dramatic increases in failures, even at 10 or 15 years, it'd be very much on our radar. And not to say that it can't happen, or not that we've had haven't all seen a couple cases of washout or extraneous things, but I think that's a minor contributing factor. But awesome question. Um, so Marianne, again, to follow up, so root and fill, apico, also the putty, yes. So seal, if you're going to do a lid technique, inject a little sealer, follow it up with the putty, and form your root end seal, as opposed to you could just go straight with the putty. But I think the studies are showing, especially the one that comes to mind is Dennis Tran. It's an ex vivo study talking about orthograde placement, but he talks about using the sealer and the putty in combo provides a better seal between the dentin and the bioceramic. Yeah, sure. Talking about washout, UT, I'm assuming that's Houston. With washout with too much sealer. I think some of that has to do with procedural technique as well as what the environment's looking like at the root tip. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome, Dr. Primus. Thanks for following up. Let's see. Extrusion of sealer and resorption. I'm sorry, y'all. I hope I'm getting to these in the correct order. Which glass ionomer do I prefer? Uh, you know, I like true glass ionomer, pure glass ionomer, if I'm going to do something like this, as opposed to the resin. Riva, um, Riva's pretty. I like Riva a lot because they have a fast set material. It uses strontium glass, so it has that much more ionic bonding to the surrounding tissue. So I like Riva Protect's a really good one. But yeah, again, GC, you can't go wrong with Equia Forte or Fuji 9. They're just tried and true. So to answer your question there, Frederica. And then can I comment on extrusion and sealer resorption? Yes. So we know that if some of these sealers are expressed and they set, they may not resorb very well. And that's okay. I'll be honest. If I'm going to extrude a type of sealer or have something into the periapical tissues, this is the material that I want. I want that material there because I'm using it for apicos. I'm using it for perf repairs. And we've seen that it forms bone, cementum, periodontal ligament onto the surface. So yes, these are the materials that I would like to have expressed. Um, I think, again, we're seeing body of evidence showing that some of it has to do with host factors and local microenvironments. In other words, if you express some sealer out into a 10 millimeter periapical radiolucency, there's more fluid flow there than there is into a case that has just widened PDL, right? There's much more fluid flow in that 10 millimeters volume wise. So I'm more likely to see the sealer resorb or be like kind of transport away from the apex as the bone's healing at the root tip, but I haven't seen it impede healing. I've also seen cases where I've had a big sealer puff in a large lucency and it hasn't resorbed at all. So again, I think some of that has to do with host factors and local microenvironment. But I haven't seen any cases where I've gotten one back and I see the sealer resorbed out into the canal. In other words, I just see a gut of perchicone sitting there inside of a large canal. I have not seen anything like that yet.
Hey, Dr. Walsh, I see Marianne Campbell has asked about ease of retreatment. Just thoughts on that and
Oh,
what's coming forward.
yeah. Funny you should ask. As a matter of fact, let me get a sip of water. We're actually launching coming up in the very near future an endodontic sealer solvent. So first of all, neosealer flow, again, the studies out of UT are very nice studies showing the retreatability comparing neosealer flow and BC sealer. Going back further, we have the Hess study that shows that BC sealer is notoriously hard to retreat, right? Avalon is neosealer flow is a bit easier to retreat. The studies show that it was 100% able to be retreated in cases where the obturation was stopped short. And again, these are ex vivo studies, right? So Avalon was easier to retreat than BC, but they were still both more challenging than H plus or something. But there's a sealer solvent coming out here in the very near future that's shown to help dissolve these bioceramic sealers and still be friendly to the dentin. So it preferentially targets the calcium in the bioactive or the bioceramic material to help dissolve that and make it easier to remove with ultrasonic or laser activation. And so we have some current ongoing studies with that. I know that we have one down at Texas A&M College of Dentistry right now. I believe Marquette, Boston. There's a couple places around the country that are working on some of the prelim studies here. So ease of retreatment with Avalon is pretty straightforward, although it's going to be even easier here coming up in the very near future with the sealer dissolver. I hope I
Awesome.
answered everybody's questions. I hope I didn't skip anybody.
No, you were awesome, Dr. Walsh. Thank you so much. Anybody else have any last minute questions before we let y'all run off of here? And again, just to clarify for your CE credit, you'll get an eval sent over to you from Zoe Cash and Tones. And then once you fill that out, she will send over your CE credit. So that will be coming tomorrow.
Awesome.
Anything else?
Well, thank you to Allison, Mike, BJ, and Jason. Thank you guys for hosting an awesome webinar tonight. I really appreciate you guys giving me time to nerd out in front of some friends and colleagues, and to those familiar faces over in the attendees. Thank you so much for attending, and a special thank you to Dr. Carolyn Primus, who's gotten a few shout outs tonight, but with her, none of this would be without her, none of this would be possible. So thanks again, Dr. Primus.